It's now my pleasure to introduce Jan Reeder, who is the next speaker of this morning's session. And in fact, I'm essentially turning the day over to her since she will be introducing this afternoon's speakers. Jan came to the museum at the beginning of the project we have. In 2005, we were awarded the grant that I mentioned before, this $4 million grant for a 3.5-year project funded by the Mellon Foundation to examine this enormous collection that we had at Brooklyn. At the time, we thought we had somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 pieces. Jan counted 24,000, so it was slightly less than we thought, but it was still an enormous project. She assembled a team of over 10 professionals who spent 3.5 years going through this collection in a way that it had never been done before, and in fact in a way that I think no collection of its size had been done before. And she not only did the job that we needed, but I think she produced a new model of the way collection reviews happen, especially for costumes, but even for other kinds of materials. And amazingly, she brought the job in on time and in budget. I had, from the beginning, in the back of my mind was how we were going to apply for extensions to this grant, because I really didn't think it would happen in 3.5 years, but in fact it did. Before our project, Jan got her education at Smith, Hunter College, and FIT. She was the curator of textiles at the Allentown Art Museum. She was the associate director and specialist of the couture department at Doyle, and she's now the consulting curator for the Brooklyn Museum costume collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She's going to speak to us about this amazingly interesting process that she developed for the examination of the collection, and as I say, she will then be the sort of master of ceremonies for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to outline for you the procedures and protocols that we developed to accomplish the goals set out in the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant that Kevin has just spoken about. The goal was to more clearly define the scope, content, and quality of the Brooklyn Museum costume collection. To this end, the project staff's mandate was to fully catalog, photograph, assess, and inventory the collection. A further directive was to identify during the assessment process a corpus of 4,000 objects that represented some of the best examples from each object type in the collection. These were to be dressed on forms or otherwise properly mounted for high-resolution photography that would, at the end of the project, be made available on ArtStore, which I'm sure many of you know is an online art image library and research initiative used by many educational and nonprofit institutions globally. This select group became known to us, we dubbed it, the Special 4000. As was already said, the material to be included in the project was the costume portion of the museum's costume and textiles holdings. This incorporated all 17th through 20th century Western European and American fashions and accessories, 20th century jewelry, Eastern and Western European folk costume, and ecclesiastical objects. Flat textiles and other regional costume material, as was already noted, were not part of this project. The duration of the project was designated to be 3 years with an end date of January 2009. Upon my arrival in fall of 2005, much of the groundwork had been laid by the museum staff. A 15,000 square foot workspace at 25 Elm Place in downtown Brooklyn on the Fulton Mall had been obtained and made habitable. The technological infrastructure connecting us to the museum's computer network and to its digital laboratory had been laid, and initial plans for the interior build-out had been drawn up. And here you will see, I'll just point out a couple of areas that you'll be seeing photographs of later. Up in the left-hand corner is the staging area where we did our, where we all worked as an ensemble team. And you will note where the photo studio is, which we, our photographer planned and built out, and the office space and all of those other areas that are marked for shelving and rolling racks. Additionally, in addition to the plans being drawn up, also minimal records that included only the accession number, the credit line, the object name, and a brief description for both costumes and textiles had been created in the museum's database system, the museum system, or TMS, as it is known. And here's just an example of one of those shell records where you have very minimal. You have the accession number and the credit line, a very, no description, just the word cloth here. These were the records that we began with. I mean, many of them, of course, many of them were much more complete than this as well. In addition to these other steps that had already been taken, one group of costumes that had been stored in one of the more remote areas of the museum, you saw a picture of that before, it was the dry cleaning rack area, had been moved to a more accessible area, and there was one intrepid art handler who had been working over the summer identifying contents of boxes. For the first 3 months after I arrived, I worked with museum staff to complete the process underway, which included the final design and build-out of the Elm Place space, preparing the collection for transfer to the new space, writing job descriptions, and hiring staff. The first of the new staff to take her position was the collections manager, Elizabeth Fiorentino, who directed 6 art handlers in preparing the objects for the transfer to the downtown space and created and implemented the logistics involved. Liz is going to tell you more about this later, but suffice it to say that after 3 months of preparation, here you can see, for instance, on your left, drawers that had just removed from cabinets and that were shrink wrapped and ready to move. And then on the right, of course, gray garment boxes, which we piled onto clothing racks and shrink wrapped, and they all moved very easily that way. So after 3 months of preparation, the collection, which had been stored in 9 different areas at the museum, was physically transferred to the new workspace in 11 days. And for the first time, it was all assembled in one place. And this was one of the last boxes that was unloaded into the new space, which had been appropriately marked by art handlers when they sealed it up in Brooklyn, the end. Also during that 3-month period, preparing for the move, a professional photographer, Leah Ingold, had been hired and took on the task of planning the photo studio within the space and selecting and ordering all of the photographic equipment needed for both the documentary photography and the high-resolution images of the Special 4000 that she would be capturing. We moved into the space in late December, and there were 4 of us in place at that time. Our first task was to establish a 3-year work plan. We did not know how many objects we were dealing with. Estimates had varied considerably from 35,000 to 70,000. So the first thing we did was to conduct 2 counts, one based on the number of shell records that I showed you before, and the other a physical count, which we based on the actual number of containers that we had moved, and estimates of the number of objects in each container. And what you're looking at here is a spreadsheet showing those counts. Although it was possible to estimate with some degree of accuracy the number of objects hanging in garment carts, and then multiplying that by the number of garment carts, educated guesswork was required for the contents of many of the other types of containers, such as boxes, drawers, and cabinets that held small objects such as gloves, stockings, and handkerchiefs. So the spreadsheet lays out the methodology and the totals from the two counts. In the first column is the object type, and the second column is all of the titles within those types under which we searched in the shell records. In the third column are the results of that count, and you'll see that the total came to 26,799. In the fourth column is the results of the physical count, which was 20,034. But so both of these were considerably lower than we had expected, even though we knew that many records contain more than one object. But so we decided to go, of course, with a larger number, 27,000 records, as our point of departure to establish our 3-year plan. We divided our 3 years into 12 3-month quarters. Then we divided 27,000 by 12 and established goals of processing 2,250 objects per quarter. We then broke that down into the number of work days per quarter, and then further into the number of cataloging hours per day, to come up with a goal of cataloging 40 objects per day at 8 minutes per object. We decided to start with 20th century garments because it was the most familiar and the easiest to physically manage, and therefore a good way to test whether our procedures were viable. We also recognized early on that it was going to be important to vary the type of material we were cataloging to avoid tedium. And so we intentionally built in a change of object types from one quarter to the next. For instance, you can see this is our first 3-year plan, and you can see that we decided to catalog 20th century garments for the first 2 quarters, and then we switched to hats, and we came back to 20th century garments later on, and that really did make a difference in terms of keeping our level of interest and excitement going and always moving forward. In January, by January 16th, 2006, we were ready to go. All staff were in place, and we had a design that allowed for flexibility, adaptability, and accessibility to each other. The photo and technological equipment were in place. Here you can see some of that equipment. It included 2 Nikon digital cameras tethered to Macintosh computers at 2 photo stations, and you're seeing that on the left. And for you camera buffs, a Hasselblad H2 format camera with an Imacon back, tethered to a Mac, which was in the photo studio. It was a very fancy camera. And that photo studio is on your right. There were also 4 laptops on rolling carts and 8 PCs in offices. And there were many ports around that we had installed around so that we could move those computers around, and we didn't exactly know why we were going to want to move the computers around when we started, but it really did make a huge difference once we got going. There were 11 of us on staff. In addition to myself in the position of curator, there was the assistant curator, Grace Hernandez, in charge of overseeing the integrity, the consistency, and accuracy of the database records. Liz, the collections manager, whom I have mentioned, who oversaw the physical and technical logistics, including keeping track of the objects as they moved around the space. The conservator and dresser, Glenn Peterson, who styled, dressed, and prepared appropriate mounts for photographing the special 4000, as well as overseeing the care and handling of the collection. The professional photographer initially was Leah Ingold, and she was succeeded by Lolly Kuhn midway during the project. And 6 research assistants, the senior research assistant Jessica Crick, and research assistants Katie Netherton, Jennifer Holly, Catherine Winters, Rachel Tu, Jessica Rawl, and Liz Randolph. Each of them held master's degrees in the study of costume and textiles. The research assistants performed daily and weekly rotating tasks, which included object preparation, data entry, documentary photography, reviewing the accession records during the cataloging process, object research, especially on the items that were going to be presented on Art Store, and one discrete research project on a topic related to the collection to be completed by the end of the project. And some of these will be presented this afternoon. This rotating tasks was a task within itself to keep it up to date for every week, and it changed and was very flexible, but somehow almost all the time everybody knew what they were doing. The staff worked as an ensemble team in the staging area, where I pointed out to you on the plan, where we processed each item. And here we are. After a preparatory stage where objects were located and tagged, items were then brought forward one at a time and hung on a costumer or placed on the table. So you can see that on the right. The cataloger verbally provided the data about the object to the research assistant who is sitting at the computer. You can see there under the clock. And she entered it into the database record. She entered the verbal descriptions, etc., into the database record. Then another research assistant was standing at the original accession records, and you can see the research assistant. I don't know who it is, actually. Anyway, standing to the left of me, and she is consulting the original accession records for the object. These records were bound in books, and I don't know if you can tell, but they were laid out all across the back there on tables, so they were very accessible. We could go back and forth to each book. Each one was opened to find the accession number for the record. So this person would read aloud the record and what was presented in the record, and any discrepancies were noted, and additional or pertinent information was added to the database record. So if there were questions, we reconciled what was in the record with what we were putting into the database. If there were discrepancies, a very time-limited attempt was made to reconcile them in the records by referring to the donor files, which were in an adjoining room. If this couldn't be quickly resolved, an appropriate box was checked on the front card of the data, in the data entry, and we just moved on. When cataloging was completed, the item was placed in a designated holding area to be photographed on a hanger or other appropriate mount in the photo station. And so you'll see the photo station on your left, and there's, I think that's Katie is shooting an object, which is hanging on the hanger there. In the case of the Special 4000, the object was sent to the photo studio to be styled and dressed on a dress form or a mannequin for high-resolution imaging. Simultaneously to all of this, the collections manager, who is sitting by the column that's to the left of center, was planning the next group of items to be reviewed, and in addition updating locations and entering component counts, as well as resolving cataloging and numbering problems. And this must have been a serious numbering conundrum that we were dealing with. After an item was photographed, it was then placed in the appropriate storage container, which would then be its permanent location for the duration of the project. The photographic images taken each day were stored in an on-site server overnight and then transferred the next day to the digital lab. The digital lab was a newly established museum department created for the efficient management of digital imaging museum-wide. The digital lab staff performed a crucial role in the costume documentation project process, collating and linking images generated by project photographers to the database system, as well as uploading them into Luna, the digital asset management system that was implemented later on in the course of the project. And here, just showing you some examples of day-to-day cataloging. On your left, I think we're doing calashes, and on the right are Austrian folk hats. On the left, I'm meeting a grebe that is actually a tippet. And here on the right, we're looking at the back of this garment in the process of describing it. Here, Liz, our collections manager, is looking at this marvelous Worth carriage dress and mantle, which is in the exhibition. And on the right, looks like she's trying to solve another accession numbering issue. Again, the photographic setup with the Max, and the camera is tethered to the Max, and that's our one of the photo stations. And as I said, we had two of them, and sometimes we only used one, but then there were other times when it was really great to have two to speed things up. In collaboration with the museum's registrars, the CDP team developed a collection-specific data screen, or front screen, that included 24 data fields. The information that the cataloger verbally provided to the data entry person, as I just described, was to fill in those fields. So this information included the object title, of course, the medium, the description of the item, the date, the maker, detailed label information. We thought it was a wonderful opportunity to include every comma and period and abbreviation and proper case that was on every label, because labels can tell a lot about a garment and its maker and its date. So we were very careful about putting everything in exactly as was on the label. Also, the cataloging, the filling in of this front card included a brief assessment of the condition, where we had a pull-down menu, and no, I'm sorry, not the pull-down menu was for the storage needs. So we assessed the brief assessment of the condition, storage needs, and then one of three designations, which Kevin has already alluded to. The first was if the object was appropriate for the special 4,000 category. The second was whether it was appropriate for this museum collection and should be maintained as part of the core collection. And the third category was that it was a candidate for deaccession. We used color-coded stickers to indicate what each object, how each object was designated. So pink was for the special 4,000. So there were tags on every garment, so we put the stickers on the tags. Green was for recommended deaccession, and a simple R written on the tag was for the core collection. That was what Harold was referring to as being as what is being partially reviewed now. So this green shows the main criteria that I use to assess the object and to assign the designations. The criteria for recommending deaccession were primarily condition, redundancy, and lack of historic or aesthetic distinction, as outlined here, especially in comparison with other similar works in the collection. The criteria for a masterwork included importance within the history of fashion and or a given designer's oeuvre, historic significance, outstanding aesthetic appearance or technical virtuosity, provenance, and rarity. And these reasons for especially for the special 4,000, were put in the curatorial remarks field on the front card. And also the reason for recommended deaccession was entered on that in the curatorial remarks field. As cataloging progressed, we found we needed to develop various documents that set out the protocols, procedures, and guidelines related to cataloging issues such as object titles, front card fields, constituents, editorial style. This having a lot to do with when you do and do not use hyphens. Can't say how much time we spent talking about hyphens. Numbering, reconciling the various numbering ways of numbering that the museum had used over the years, and also making a glossary of sort of technical definitions. So these documents were all works in progress, which we kept updated by what we termed the daily roundup. As new matters presented themselves during the cataloging process, the data entry person quickly noted them in the daily roundup And at the end of each quarter, these were included in the appropriate documents for future reference. And that was the way we attempted to create consistency in our records. On this daily roundup, I think we're discussing how to, the order in which to describe lace. We found that with each object type, we needed to develop a strategy for how we were going to describe that object type, what order we were going to enter the different data. And so we had a lot of discussions about that in this attempt to be consistent with with what we were saying about an object and how we were entering it. Meanwhile, over in the photo studio, the goal for the special 4000 photography was to make the object understandable and attractive without being overly editorial by accessorizing or using colored backgrounds or dramatic lighting. So they were documentary shots, but we also wanted them to have some sense of style and glamour at the same time, and obviously attractiveness. Initially, Glenn and I did not know how much curatorial input from me would be needed regarding the styling of the objects and positioning the mannequins for the photography, but Glenn, as I've said, who's the conservator and dresser, quickly took over that, assumed that responsibility. I would check in periodically in the studio, or he would consult with me when there were certain decisions to be made. This easy communication was facilitated by the close proximity of all the workspaces. Also, Glenn had printouts of all of the reasons for the Special 4000, which, as I mentioned before, were recorded in the curatorial remarks fields. So he would note what had been indicated were the most important aspects about a certain object, such as interesting seams or ornamentation or some aspect of the silhouette, and then he would plan with the photographer to take shots to include or emphasize those features. And I reviewed the images each week with our photographer as well to assure that they fulfilled our needs. So there's some shots of the various types of mannequins and dress forms that Glenn had to work with, and you can see it's quite a variety, not only of the dress forms here, but also the clothing that's being dressed. He had a selection of essentially 5 different types of forms to work with, which included various mannequins, display forms, and dressmaker forms, each with variations. One type had arms and articulated hands, for instance. Some mannequins have heads and some didn't. There's quite a bit of variation in what the choices that he had, and of course he had to make these choices in sort of a split-second manner because he and the photographer had to keep up a pace of at least 7 objects per day. Almost all of the forms were existing property of the Brooklyn Museum, and fortunately they were adequate to most needs. This is Glenn addressing Queen Victoria, and she is in the exhibition. The selection of form depended on the period of the garment, and it's the size or fit, the construction, and aesthetic considerations so that the garment would look as attractive as possible. The quantity and variety of forms was such that he could maintain a constant stream of objects to the photos set. Although there was general consistency in the types and dates of objects that he and the photographer would be shooting at any given time, he sometimes had to be judicious in selecting what he would be the order of objects, so that he was not jumping between different periods on any given day, so that it would be a quicker process. The most challenging aspect of the Special 4000 photography for both Glenn and Leah or Lolly was maintaining the pace over the duration of the project, which, as I said, required a minimum of 7 objects to be prepared, dressed, photographed, and then undressed each day. While it was, according to Glenn, fairly easy to keep up with the 20th century garments, it was impossible to keep up that pace with the 19th century garments, and certain of the 20th century ball gowns, such as the one on your right, and wedding dresses, which were much more time-consuming to prepare and dress, and often cumbersome and heavy. I can't really even imagine or remember how many hours it took for Glenn. I think he was working on it for days to get this Charles James abstract gown in shape to photograph it. And he definitely looks like a mechanic under a car, I think, there. On your left, he's dressing the Roebling court gown, which is upstairs in the exhibition. And so he was dressing it, of course, for the photography that you see now on Art Store and in the publication as well. Slowdowns in the photography were compensated by periods of accessory photography, which would progress at a faster pace. Also, in addition to that, we had planned into the project that the final 3 months we would complete the cataloging 3 months prior to the end of the project to leave room for record review and research. So the photographers were able to continue to work for those 3 months without getting so they could fill in the backlog, and they were not getting fed new material all of the time. So it did work out. Here you're seeing other kinds of mounts that were also used, pinning dresses that were too fragile to dress onto a slant board so that it could be photographed in that way. And on the right are some stocking boots, which also we used a slant board to photograph. In reality, the 40 object per day, 8 minute per object scheme that we had established varied wildly, as you can imagine. But we kept a close eye on our numbers during each quarter, and we adjusted our plan when it was necessary to balance that goal requirement with the varying times needed to catalog each category. This sometimes required some what I would call logistical hijinks, such as having 2 teams simultaneously cataloging. This is when those rolling computers came in very handily. Or sometimes inserting material not originally in the quarterly plan that we knew would move more quickly through the process. So if we got towards the end and we recognized we were not going to make it to that 2,250 object goal, we would adjust the type of material that we were processing. I must say that establishing that goal as the top priority was the driving force behind our successful completion of the task. And we did meet that goal each time, despite moments when we sort of lost our focus. If you remember at the beginning of the talk, I said that we estimated we would be processing 27,000 records. In the end, the exact number was 23,826 records, and which was approximately 30,000 objects. And of course, the difference between records and objects is that there are many records have more than one object in them. For instance, a dress with a belt is 2 objects or components. A pair of shoes can be counted as 2 objects. So that's where there's a lot of wiggle room in statistics about object count. But the record count was 23,834. This is our final 3-year plan, and I think it will be interesting to actually, I have not had a chance to actually compare that first plan with what we actually ended up doing, but I think it's quite different, but working within this structure was what made it possible to then adjust as we went along. Having the structure is what made it possible to adjust as we went along. The photographs and information now at the end of this, at the end of the project, now the photographs and the information for the Special 4000 group are available on ArtStore, and just recently also on the Met website. And of course, the 250 objects selected from the 4,000 are published in the book that accompanies the 2 exhibitions. Some of the significant, just a few of the significant statistics that we compiled about the collection's holdings are that the Charles James holdings total just under 800 objects. There are 220 garments, 7 accessories, 370 sketches, and 190 patterns, which include both muslin and flat paper pattern, muslin and paper flat patterns, as well as half and full sewn patterns. And here's a wonderful example of a dress that belonged to Millicent Rogers. That you have the dress and the full, almost full sewn muslin or partial, sort of half sewn, and then a sketch that he also did of the dress. It is not particularly common that with James you have an actual sketch where you can look at and say, oh, this is actually the dress. But in this case, it all came together. Also, there are plaster molds and various dress forms that James designed, and this day was very interesting. We discovered that this blue dress form, which I believe, but I need to check, was made for the diamond dress that actually is on view upstairs. And the plaster mold, which is sort of, we felt like we were in an Egyptian excavation on this day. We fit the blue form into it, and it fits perfectly. So that was the mold that was used, that he created to create this form. There are just over 200 Schiaparelli garments and accessories, many of which belong to Millicent Rogers. And it's a wonderful holdings. I always say this, the holdings, especially Millicent Rogers' group of clothing, is like a textbook of what you know about Schiaparelli. And this is, of course, the very well-known musical note dress that's embroidered by Lesage and has a music box in the belt buckle. You know, I would love to know that, and I'm also wondering. I don't know because it doesn't play now, and I'm also wondering if actually I wanted to see if someone could transcribe the notes on the musical score on the dress to see if they suggest a tune, and maybe Dillis has some sort of insight about this, but it's. And almost 800 Belle Epoque garments, very strong and beautiful holdings of early 20th century couturiers. This is a Doucet, and almost 100 Worth gowns that represent almost all 100 years of the House of Worth, from a wonderful 1865 Worth a Boberg, which is in the show, to a 1939 evening gown in a zigzag, a very jazzy zigzag chine pattern by Roger Worth. Wonderful holdings, as was mentioned before, by American women designers. The designers, many of the American women designers, were very involved with the design services of the Brooklyn Museum and did leave great holdings of their works here, especially sort of the mother lode of the works of Elizabeth Hawes are in this collection, and this is a Hawes wedding dress, one of those pieces that was not easy to photograph. And we created nearly 30,000 photographs, such as this one, which shows a complete wedding underwear or lingerie ensemble. So on the left is the wedding dress, and then on the you have subsequent layers of her undergarments, and on the right is the a nightgown that went with the ensemble. So it was wonderful to have the opportunity to do these kinds of photographs, which we found as we went along. We had we didn't know how long it was going to take to photograph these things. So in the beginning, we were very judicious about taking any extra shots or any extra details. But as time went on, we got more and more into it. And you can see this one was really quite a great project. And then there's the other end of the spectrum. Little paper bikini pajamas. And at the end of the project, our collections manager was jumping for joy. And we were all jazzed up. Thank you. So I will entertain any questions. Is anything?
May I ask my question?
Yes.
Jan, was it for the fact that Brooklyn was building a collection of American designers that Charles James garments were accepted? Or did he or Mrs. Rogers have a personal relationship with Brooklyn to have acquired so many garments, illustrations, muslins, patterns? Coming from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, of course, it's the life of the designer that's just as important to our students. So I'm very curious as to the relationship with the museum.
Right. That was one of the real revelations of our project, actually, was the extraordinary influence that Charles James had in creating in developing this collection. He really was a central figure. We don't know specifically how he first connected with the museum, but what I do know, by the early 1940s, the museum was really renowned for its design consultation and its relationship with the design community, especially in relationship to fashion. And so somehow, and it was very important to James that his work be taught, that people learn from his work. So it was sort of a natural attraction to the Brooklyn Museum. The first thing he started doing here was working with Michelle Murphy, who you'll hear about later, in 1944 on a project where they measured 19th century bodices in the collection, and it was his intention to see what measurement, he wrote in letters that he wanted to see what measurements in a woman's body or in the bodices remained the same over time, because he was interested in developing patterns that can then be used for mass production. This was something that he was always trying to do throughout his life. And so he actually did end up developing 15 patterns from this bodice measuring project that he did with Michelle Murphy. From that work with Michelle on that, one letter that he wrote said that it developed then into the idea of creating an exhibition or working with Millicent Rogers in creating a body of work of the designs that he had done for her over 10 years. I didn't say that exactly right. What he ended up doing was creating patterns, and I think probably the full sewn muslin that you just saw is an example of that. Of designs that he had done for Millicent Rogers over the years. And the first exhibition at the opening of the Design Lab in 1948 was an exhibition of primarily Millicent Rogers clothing and the patterns that James made for the exhibition that were in relation to those clothes. It's also not very clear, but it seems that he made some duplicate garments actually to show there in the exhibition. But there are a couple of duplicate garments which would bear up that fact, but not that many. So I'm not exactly sure how that all worked, but. All by way of saying that after that show in 1948, which was called the Decade of Design, that is when the real core of this collection was amassed. The donations just poured in from all over for the next 20 years. So he was really enormously and he was instrumental because. He, as either Harold or Kevin had said before, he wanted to leave his legacy at the Brooklyn Museum, and he got all of his influential clients to give their clothes to the clothes that he had made for them to the Brooklyn Museum, as well as to give funds or to purchase examples of his works that would fill in holes in his body of work here, so that his whole legacy would be presented in this museum.
Jan, finally, The objects that you showed us, the plaster and the forms, were those for storage of his garments, or were those for exhibitions specifically, perhaps for this exhibit? And finally, I think I recall that there is a film of a Charles James fashion show on an oval stage here at Brooklyn. Have you seen this, or do you know of this fashion show, which I would love to know more about?
I haven't seen it. I understand there is a short film clip of James holding calipers around someone's body. Kevin, do you know maybe of any such thing here? No.
I've seen various clips. There's of him writing his signature, and they're very small clips. Go to YouTube; they're on there.
Yeah, no, but that's something to certainly look into.
The photographs of the 4,000 pieces are so marvelous. I'm on number 2501 right now. And my question is, did you do any Photoshop work on those images? Because some of them I can't tell how, like the parasols, some of them or the canes are actually held up.
Yeah, there was no photoshopping.
Wow.
It was all done in the photo studio, and all the mounting and so on was primarily planned by Glenn.
It's beautiful. Speaking of the Charles James pieces from Glier, I think that there needs to be another catalog to update Ann Coleman's work, because of this is such an extraordinary collection, and to finally have it kind of all out there, it's great.
Yes.
Hi, Jan. Needless to say, what a tremendous undertaking. And I'm curious to know, in terms of the designation of the Special 4000, did that happen during the physical inventory, the initial one? And was your thinking revised as the process went along? Were you working towards a quota by genre or garment type, or trying to fill out certain number expectations? If you could just speak to that process a little more, maybe.
I would, yes.
Thanks.
And it's all of the above. In the at the initial stages, when before I was hired, it was decided the number 4,000 was chosen to be the number that should be presented on Art Store, should be ready for Art Store at the end of the project. So I'm not quite sure how that number was arrived at, but that was what I was told that we had to do. So, yes.
I can say it was chosen at random. We just sort of said we have to come up with a number that looks good in this grant as a number of objects that will really be, carry the collection, and that was the number we came up with.
Right. So, maybe it was a percentage of something like the 70,000 or something. I don't know. But anyway, so we just plunged in, and in the beginning, I just chose what I really thought were highlights, and I wasn't worried. I thought somehow it will all work out, and so as we went along, I just sort of did it according to what I thought were the best pieces, and it did work out. I suppose as time went on, I got a little freer about when I realized that what the numbers were, that I probably got freer about what I would recommended for the 4,000. So, I mean, obviously, some of the 4,000 are better than others of the 4,000. I mean, I think probably any collection, maybe the top 10% is maybe, or not even 10%, is really the creme de la creme of a collection. But I don't think that answers the question. It did happen as we were going along with that verbal cataloging, that decision was made. Okay. Thank you.